Ah, the humble screw thread, a true marvel of modern technology. It has 1,000,001 uses, like fastening two things together. Or transmitting motion. It can even be used to take highly accurate measurements. That's right, from the wood screw to the automobile, and the entire precision manufacturing process required to produce them, the humble screw thread makes it all possible. But what exactly is a screw thread? How do they work and where do they come from? Well, dear friends, those are some of the great mysteries of the universe. Questions that scientists have been trying to answer for thousands of generations. And unfortunately, we still just don't really know. However, thanks to advancements in things like modern medical technology, genetic engineering, and particle physics, we do know how to reproduce them. And that is what we're going to talk about in this video. Now, when I first learned to cut my own screw threads, I watched a lot of very helpful videos made by some very hardworking and talented people. And I would recommend that you watch any of those same videos made by people who have been doing this a lot longer than I have and who are a lot better at it. With that said, most of the videos that I've seen on this subject all have one thing in common. And this is that while they'll give you the steps required to create a screw thread on your lathe, they won't necessarily take the time to explain exactly what it is that you're trying to make and why taking these steps in this specific order will produce that thing. In other words, they'll give you the how, but not necessarily the why. And for me at least, this is sort of like having a recipe, but not knowing what any of the ingredients taste like. Sure, I could follow that recipe exactly and produce the desired result, but it's going to be a very rigid and confining experience. Where on the other hand, if I'm familiar with all of those ingredients and I know what each one is being used for, this is where I can relax and allow my creativity to take over. I can improvise, move things around in the process, or remove some of those ingredients altogether, being confident that I know what effect those changes are going to have on the final product. So, before we head over to the lathe and start cutting threads, let's see if we can't really enrage the comment section and break down exactly what it is that we're trying to make in very simple and hobby-friendly terms. Now, if you look up threading in the Machinery's Handbook, you're going to find a lot of information. Mathematical formulas, definitions, diagrams of thread forms with mathematical formulas and definitions, tons, and I mean tons of charts, all conveniently laid out over the course of a couple hundred pages. What I'm saying is, it's a lot. And while the information in the handbook is not only fantastic, but a surefire cure for your insomnia, I don't think that this is the best place for us to start. So then, that brings us back to our question, what exactly is a screw thread? Well, believe it or not, I've actually been thinking about this, and I feel like our definition should make sense in the context of how we intend to make our thread, which is of course on the lathe. And before I go any further, I feel like it's only right that I give out this disclaimer that I've given out 100 times before, and that is, I am not a real machinist. I only play one on the internet, and I don't even play a good one at that. So I'm sure a lot of the things that I say and demonstrate here are going to be technically wrong, but these are things that have helped me to better understand what I'm doing in the shop, so I'm going to share them here. But please, by all means, feel free to have a complete and total emotional meltdown in the comment section below. That being said, here's what I've come up with. A screw thread is a helical groove of a particular shape or form cut into either the outer diameter of a shaft or the inner diameter of a bore of a particular size. But what the heck does that mean? Okay, before we get into the helical nature of that groove, let's talk about that specific shape or form, because this is your thread form. And there are a lot of different thread forms. But for our intents and purposes, at least in the hobby shop anyway, there's really two major forms that you're going to deal with. And those are the V thread and the Acme thread. First, let's talk about the V thread because this is your most common thread. The V thread form is defined by a 60-degree V shape. 60 degree. This is what you're going to find on nuts and bolts and just general stuff in the house and around the shop. Your Acme thread is very similar to the V thread, except that instead of a 60-degree V, it's defined by a 29-degree V with a small flat on the top. The size of that flat on the top of your Acme form is going to be determined by the pitch of the thread. We'll talk about the pitch in just a minute. Now, because a threading tool is a form tool, the form of your thread is going to determine the shape of your cutter. So for your 60-degree thread, you're going to have a 60-degree tool. As you can see, the tip of this tool conforms exactly to that 60-degree V. And you'll find that your Acme thread cutting tool is exactly the same. It conforms to that 29-degree V. And if we check the flat on the top, this tool is specifically for cutting 10 TPI Acme threads, and you can see that it fits right in that little slot for the 10 TPI thread. So in the most simplified terms, for our purposes at least, the only difference between cutting, say, a standard 60-degree thread for a bolt or something like that, or a 29-degree thread for an Acme screw in one of your machines is going to be the shape of your tool. As long as you're using a 60-degree tool, you're going to cut a 60-degree thread. And if you're using a 29-degree tool, you're going to cut a 29-degree Acme thread. Okay, so now that we know that you can create different kinds of threads using different shapes or forms of tools, let's talk about that helix or spiral, because this is your thread pitch. And all that the thread pitch does is describe how many times that helix or spiral wraps around the diameter of your work, whether it be a shaft or a bore, over a given distance. In our case, that distance is 1 inch. So for instance, let's imagine that this is an 1.5 inch diameter shaft and I want to create an 1.5 inch by 8 TPI thread. If we also imagine that this orange string is the groove or form being created by my thread tool, then that means that over the course of 1 inch of the length of this shaft, that I want to make this string wrap around its diameter 8 times. Now, let's also imagine that my hand is the carriage and start spinning the spindle. If I leave the carriage in place as the spindle spins, then you can see that the string just wraps around itself. However, if I start moving the carriage forward in relation to the rotation of the spindle, you can see that that spiral starts to appear. And if I move the carriage faster in relation to the rotation of the spindle, you can see that that spiral gets wider. And if I slow that movement down, the spiral gets tighter. So the faster the carriage moves, the lower the thread count, or the wider the spiral, and the slower it moves, the tighter that spiral is going to get. So this means that in order to create the spiral or pitch that I want, I need to also create a predictable relationship between the rotation of my spindle and the movement of the carriage. And this is where your lead screw and half nut come in. Because your lead screw also has a pitch, as you close your half nut around the lead screw and the lead screw turns inside of that half nut, this is going to cause your carriage to move in accordance with the pitch of your lead screw. So in the case of our 1.5 inch by 8 TPI thread, I want to make sure that my lead screw is spinning at the correct speed to cause my carriage to move 1 inch in the same amount of time that it takes my spindle to make 8 revolutions. So if I have an 8 TPI lead screw, like I do here, that means that in the amount of time that it takes my spindle to make 8 full revolutions, I also want my lead screw to make 8 full revolutions, because this is going to cause my carriage to move 1 inch. This is going to be a 1-to-1 relationship between the spindle and the lead screw. So with that in mind, we can now think about how changing that relationship between the rotation of the lead screw and the spindle will change the amount of times that helix wraps around our work. For example, if I wanted to create, say, a 16 TPI thread as opposed to the 8 TPI thread, well, I know that if my lead screw spins 8 times, that it's going to move my carriage forward 1 inch and I can't change the pitch of my lead screw. So if I want to change the shape of that helix, I need to make sure that my spindle is going to spin 16 times in the same amount of time that it takes this lead screw to move the carriage 1 inch. So for every 8 revolutions of my lead screw, I'd need to create 16 revolutions of my spindle, making a 2-to-1 relationship between the lead screw and the spindle. And of course, the way that you change that relationship between the lead screw and the spindle is going to be with either your gearbox or change gears. And hopefully, if you do have a change gear only lathe, understanding a bit more about how that relationship works is going to make it easier to identify the correct change gears to get whatever effect you want. Well, I'll be the first to admit that got a little long-winded, but hopefully we can now go into the actual thread cutting with a little more confidence, having at least a bit of a better understanding as to how it all works and why it works. So we're going to be making a 3/4 by 10 TPI standard 60-degree V thread, if for no other reason that this stock I have is 3/4 inch. So I'll give this a quick cleanup and then we'll go from there. We're now down to our major diameter, but before we start cutting threads, there's a couple things that I like to do to prepare the stock. The first thing that I'm going to do is to put a nice leading chamfer down here at the starting end of the thread. We're going to cut the thread starting down this end and going in this direction. So I'm going to put a nice leading chamfer on this end just to give my tool a bit of a softer start going into the cut. The second thing that we're going to want to do is to cut a thread relief down at the end of our thread. This is basically a gutter, an undercut that provides a spot for our cutting tool to run out at the end of the thread. Now, personally, when I cut my thread relief, I normally like to cut it down to the actual depth of the thread. And to be honest, thread depth is a pretty nuanced subject. It has to do with the class of thread fit that you're after, and there can be a lot to it. But for this example, we're going to go with the simple coarse V thread formula right out of the Machinery's Handbook, and that is 0.866 divided by the pitch of your thread. So for our example, it's going to be 0.866 divided by 10 because we're making a 3/4 10 TPI Acme thread, which means we're going to cut the thread relief 86 thousandths deep. Okay, we're just about ready to start cutting our thread, but before we do, the question on everybody's mind, I'm sure, do you have to use the compound, and if so, how do you set it? Well, the short answer to this question is no. You absolutely do not have to use your compound when cutting threads. However, there are some circumstances where using the compound can be beneficial because it helps to relieve tool pressure. When cutting a coarser pitched thread, especially of a larger diameter, setting your compound to slightly less than half of the included angle of your thread form can greatly help to relieve tool pressure. There are a couple things you'll want to remember when using your compound to feed your tool. First, like I already mentioned, you'll only want to use the compound when cutting coarse pitched threads, especially in larger diameter work. My sort of personal general rule, I guess, is that anything over 16 to 18 TPI, I won't use the compound. Anything less than that, I normally decide whether or not I'm going to use the compound based on the diameter of the work. Second is that you're going to want to choose the angle that's appropriate for the thread that you're cutting. Like I mentioned earlier, that angle should be slightly less than half of the included angle of your thread form. So for instance, a 60-degree thread, you'll be right around 29.5 degrees on your compound. Or if you're cutting a 29-degree thread, you want to be just above 14 degrees. And last but not least is that when you set that angle, you want to make sure that the movement of your compound is going in the same direction as the thread that you're cutting. So for instance, a normal right-hand thread where we cut from the tailstock towards the headstock, you'll want to have your compound facing the headstock in its movement. If I was cutting a left-hand thread where we cut away from the headstock, then I would have my compound flipped in the other direction. And we will be using the compound to cut this thread. One last thing to talk about before we get started, and that is of course the threading dial. So when you're cutting a thread, you will of course engage your half nut. This is going to cause your carriage to move forward, and your tool is going to cut a groove into your work. When you get to the end of the thread that you're cutting, you will then disengage your lead screw and move the carriage back to the beginning of your thread. Then, in order to take your next cutting pass, you of course have to re-engage the lead screw. But how do you know when it's safe to re-engage the lead screw and line back up with that same groove that you were cutting in the last pass? Well, that's where the threading dial comes in. As you can see, on the bottom of the threading dial is a small helical gear, and this gear engages with the lead screw. As the lead screw spins, it'll turn this gear, which in turn causes this dial on the top to spin. As you can see on mine, there's a small nub, there might be a small tick or a mark on yours, and then there's a bunch of dashes and numbers on the dial. As this spins, you'll see that those dashes and numbers will line up with that nub or tick mark or whatever you have. As these dashes and numbers line up with that nub, this is what tells you when it's safe to re-engage your lead screw. And to know which numbers are safe for whichever pitch thread that you're cutting, you will use the threading chart or table. The chart is normally located right on the threading dial, but if it's not, it might be on your headstock or in your user manual. If you absolutely don't have the threading chart for your lathe, it's not a big deal. This chart is just a function of the pitch of your lead screw. A little bit of math can tell you everything that you need to know. You can also just go online and find a threading chart for whatever pitch lead screw that you have, print it out, and keep it with your machine. When you're just getting started, if you're just not comfortable or not sure, you can always just re-engage on the same number, or leave your half nut engaged the entire time and just don't disengage it until you're done cutting your thread. All right, I think we're finally ready. I have my 60-degree thread form in my tool holder. I have my spindle set to 175 RPM. You don't have to thread at any specific RPM, but a nice, modest, slow speed just makes everything a lot more controllable and a lot less stressful. Of course, I have my gearbox set to 10 TPI. Let's get started. Alright, so I've covered the part in die-chem just to make things easier to see, and the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to use my cross slide to just touch off on the work with my cutting tool. I'm then going to set this as the 0 on my cross slide. According to my threading chart, I can engage on 1, 2, 3, or 4 for a 10 TPI thread. So I'll just go ahead and engage on 1. I haven't moved my cutting tool since I touched off on the work, so this first pass will be a very light scratch pass. At the end of the pass, I'll disengage the half nut, use my cross slide to retract the cutting tool, and return to the beginning of the cut. I'll use a thread gauge just to confirm that the pitch is correct, and I am ready to proceed. For my next pass, I'll return my cross slide back to the 0 that I set earlier, and then use my compound to feed in for my depth of cut. And now I just wait for the threading dial to come back around to the right number, and I take my second pass. And from here, it's just repeat that same process over again. Disengage the half nut at the end of my cut, retract the tool using the cross slide, go back to the beginning of the cut, return my cross slide back to my 0 point, set my depth of cut using the compound, and then engage on the right number once again. And this is the dance. Once you know the steps, you just keep dancing until the music stops, or, until you hit your thread depth, and that's all there is to it. Well, I guess that's about all I have to say about that, for now at least. I hope that this video was helpful. Actually, I hope that this video makes sense. I don't know, it feels like there might be a lot of incoherent babbling on my part. At the very least, I do hope that if you've been hesitant to try single point threading for whatever reason, I hope this video is enough to show that there really isn't that much to it. There's no black magic or really complicated formulas. It's really just cutting spirals and getting your lathe to cut the size spiral that you want. As usual, if you have made it this far into the video, thank you so very much. I do truly appreciate each and every one of you, so thank you. Of course, an extra special thank you to my patrons. You find value in and support the work that I do, and for that, I could not possibly thank you enough, so thank you. If you would also like to support my work, you can find a link to my Patreon in the description below. If you are already a subscriber, of course, thank you for that as well. And if you're not a subscriber, but you like what I do here and you feel like I've earned it, give me a like and a subscribe. If you feel like I haven't, let me know what I can do better in the comments down below. And as always, until next time, get out there, make something awesome. Most importantly, have some fun, and I hope to see you all again very, very soon.